What are they for? Well, they're for to help us remember. At our age, we need them too, don't we? Remember? And so we never forget. You have memorials. Anybody recognize any of these memorials? What's the one on the left? Washington. And the middle one's easy. All right. And the upper right? Jefferson Memorial, yeah. And down in the lower right? Yeah. How about the one on the upper left? The unknown soldier. And we never forget. Upper right.
Oh, the right.
I just cheated
Not
on it because I
Rushmore.
knew you was going right. What is upper right? Now Rushmore. That's a lot of work. Anybody ever been there and seen it in real? Isn't it great?
I hope nobody ever wants to take that down.
It is very soft.
Okay, we're not going there this morning. What about the bottom one?
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor. What ship's down below there?
Arizona.
Arizona. People know. Let's bring it into Texas. What's that one on the upper left? San Jacinto Monument. Yeah, just outside the edge of Houston there. And of course, the upper right, we all know that one, don't we?
Yeah.
Because it
Remember
says
the Alamo.
remember.
The lower one on the left.
Is that
Memorial to the peace officers. I think it's in Austin. So, well, that's a neat memorial to the peace officers. How about the lower right?
Sam Houston.
I heard two different names.
Sam Houston. No? Stephen F. Austin.
Stephen F. Austin. Yeah, it's written down there. Can't you read it, Willie? Stephen F. Austin. Underneath it, it says the father of Texas. What about that?
Oh,
Huh?
Twin Towers.
Yeah, the Twin Towers that we never forget on there. In the Old Testament times, people had to rely on their memory. That we to recall past events, since there was very little writing and very little preserving of some of these writings in their time. So they had to recall their memory. God did not want the Israelites to forget certain events and miracles. God often had ways of creating memorials or having the Israelites create memorials as reminders so that they could pass this information down to their children and their children's children. A memorial was often just a pile of stones. Many times it was a feast or a festival set at a certain time of the year. It could even be a meal or an item placed in the Ark of the Covenant. What was the purpose of these memorials, feasts, and other items? It was for remembrance, so that we might never forget. In Genesis 9, you remember this, God said, I will, what? Remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and what? Remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So there's a memorial that God created, one for remembrance. The Feast of the Tabernacles. You've probably heard of this before. Who knows what that feast was for? What did they need to remember? Somebody. Tabernacle.
Yeah, they all built their little shacks in the streets and
You're right.
lived in them. And
So you have children, and you're in this time period, and you're an Israelite, and you have children, and you want them to remember things, and so one day you go out and you build this little shack, and you go spend the night in there, and the kids are saying, why are we doing this? Why are we in the house? And the reason is for remembrance. So then the parent has to tell the stories about the exodus of Egypt and how they had to live, and they had to have temporary shelters and keep moving and keep moving and keep moving. It was a feast to be done once a year.
in Jerusalem.
Huh?
In Jerusalem, they had to
Yeah,
travel there.
and it helps them to remember. See, today we don't have to worry about it as much. We got the Bible, we can pick it up and we can read it. They didn't have that. So God wanted a way to preserve history of what was going on. And so when they would get in these shacks like that, and for the night they would say, okay, you need to explain to your children why they're there. And that's how you keep the story going and you kept it alive.
Well, I wanted to ask you all who traveled over there in the Holy Land, and I probably never will be able to unless God provides. But I've wondered about some of those monuments and things that we read about in the Bible, if you've ever seen any of them.
No,
You ever
and
seen
so
those stacked
many of
stones?
them are just stones stacked on stones.
And
we'll
nobody
talk about
tells
that
you
in a
that's
minute.
what they are.
No, they're just probably not there now. They showed us a house that they thought was where like Peter lived,
Oh,
but they're quick to tell you we believe it and we think this is where Peter lived, and it was below ground, so they put plastic over the top, hard plastic. You walk and look down in there. So there's some things preserved, but so often they say we think live there. We did get to go to the island of Patmos and went into the cave, and they're sure that that's the cave where John wrote the book of Revelation, is in the island of Patmos as he sat there in a cave. So, yeah, there's not a lot left. And you think about Golgotha, that hill.
yes.
You know, you see, we make pictures of it, and there's these 3 crosses up there. Now you go there, well, that's all covered with buildings and commercial stuff, and you can't find it. So you're walking down this busy street, and you go into this church, and you're looking, and they say, see that hole right there? That's where its cross was.
That's so sad.
It is. And it may not be the real spot, but that's the one they celebrate for it. And that's okay. That's okay, too. But yeah, it's hard. That stuff doesn't remain. So we're just grateful that we have the Bible to look at that has history preserved for us that we can read on there. What was the Feast of Passover, and what did God want the Israelites to remember? Passover.
Getting out of Egypt. The children of the Egyptians being killed, the firstborn of everything.
All right.
Just the children.
Remember, there was 10 plagues when Moses went before them. The
Yes.
10th plague was a tough one. That was going to be the last one. God said the death angel is going to pass over, and he's going to kill the firstborn of all the children, of all the animals, everything. But there's a provision. If you take and get your best lamb that night, and you slay that lamb, and you take that blood, you put it over the doorpost, up and down the side. You see the picture? What do you see?
Cross.
Yeah, blood on the cross, see? But they put it down probably both sides of the door. So when the death angel came over, this is where we get that word Passover. He passed over and didn't touch that house. And it said you could hear wailing and crying throughout Egypt, and all the people crying for the loss of their children, their firstborn. But yet there was a Passover. So God did not want the Israelites to forget this. If that generation passes on, how's the next generation going to remember it? So they have the Feast of the Passover, and it was a meal that they had to remind them to celebrate that Passover once a year. They did not want them to forget. Now in Exodus 16, Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." He did not want them to forget. As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna in the ark with the tablets of the covenant law, the 10 Commandments, so that it might be preserved. Now, I really thought Charlie was going to be here today, and Charlie always looks at something in the scripture, and he always asks me a question. Well, what's that? So I was prepared for Charlie, and he didn't come today. How much is an omer? Anybody know?
A bushel.
Huh?
A bushel.
Who said a bushel? You did good.
I did.
Just barely short of a bushel. An omer is approximately one bushel.
I looked it up.
You did good, Sharon. I'm proud of you. You were right on done. It's 3.5 liters. That's a little shy of a gallon. But I have another way they showed you how much an omer was, and it was kind of hard for me to get a home. It was also said that an omer takes the place of 43 eggs. I don't know. It seems like that would take more than a couple of gallons. All right. The thing was, memorials weren't found just in the Old Testament. That's all I've showed you so far. But let's look at one that you and I practice often. Oh. What is this memorial? What is it that Jesus wants us to remember?
His blood.
His blood.
His
Huh?
sacrifice.
He died on the cross for us.
Okay. He died on the cross for us. Let's do
Let's
a
do
little more
in
talking. Let's get more
remembrance.
information. What?
Let's do in remembrance of me.
He said, do this in remembrance of me. We did. We said that. Why were they there in the first place?
Night before the crucifixion.
It was the night before the crucifixion. Huh?
Passover.
He got it. Well, he got it.
Yeah.
They were celebrating the Passover feast, like I said, they do once a year. Now, what Jesus did is he changed this from being the Passover and looking backwards for what God did, and he changed it to the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, what Jesus is going to do. Do you see that? He changed that meal, so we don't necessarily celebrate Passover. What do we celebrate here in the church? And we do it about 4 times a year.
Communion.
We call it communion or the Lord's Supper, because Jesus says that often you eat or drink of this, do it in remembrance of me, he said. So he said he took the bread and he broke it. He said it represents my body being broken for you. And then he drank of the cup, and they shared the same cup, and he said, you do this so that you remember that I shed my blood. We do that even today. Thank goodness we don't share the same cup anymore. And back in Corinthians, Paul wrote back to that church, and he criticized them for the way that they did the Lord's Supper. Why did he criticize them?
They were having a party.
It was a feast, it was a party, and some of the people couldn't even get up to the front to have the meals. Do you think they were doing it in remembrance of Jesus, or were they doing it as a party, a feast? And Paul said they were doing it because it was a feast, and you were neglecting some of the people that wanted to participate. So, if you ever wonder why we have such a small piece of bread or cracker and such a small amount of liquor, you could probably credit Paul with that for saying it's not about what you're drinking. It's not to quench your thirst. It's not a meal for you. We do that in remembrance. It's a memorial. So Jesus took what was the Passover feast, which was remembrance of what was done, and he said it's the Lord's Supper, it's the Last Supper, it's the Thursday night before he went to the cross, and it's going to be for the future. It's going to be my blood shed for you, my body broken for you. So, which one do we celebrate now? We do the Lord's Supper. The Jewish people that don't recognize Jesus as the Messiah, they're still going to celebrate the Passover feast. And they'll keep looking for a Messiah. We found him, we know him, and that's why we have this. Do this, Jesus said, in remembrance of me. A bushel. You really looked that up, did you?
I did.
I'm proud of you, Sharon.
I wrote it in my Bible.
Good for you. Today we're going to be reading about the events that took place in Joshua chapter 4. And I did all of that to lead up into chapter 4. We will see that God gave Joshua instructions for making a memorial so that the crossing of the Jordan River into the promised land would not be forgotten. Last Sunday, we read the scriptures where the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant down into the Jordan River. When they touched the water, a great wind came and blew the waters back towards the north, stopping the flowing of the water, and the Israelites crossed over on dry land. Now let's continue reading in chapter 4. It said, when the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. And where will they stay that night? We talked about this last week, in case you weren't here. They crossed the Jordan and they went across and they stayed at Gilgal. That's where God told them to camp there until he was ready for them to move on to take on Jericho. So they're camped here. So he said, take the stones and carry them to the place where you're going to camp tonight. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and he said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, just the way God told him. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder. You know why that's important to me? Because I was trying to figure out, did they get a little stone or did they get a huge stone? It's got to be big enough you carry on your shoulder. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of tribes of the Israelites to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean over here? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it crossed the Jordan River. The waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a what? A memorial to the people of Israel forever. A memorial is what? Reminder. It's a reminder that they never should forget what God did for them to get them across the Jordan River. So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them to their camp where they put them down. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priest who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood. And they are there to this day being at the time of this writing. I doubt, Joe Beth, we could find anything over there. I'll show you why in a minute. Now, here's some possibilities. These aren't real pictures that were taken back in Joshua's day, by the way. These are some stones that have been stacked up. Somebody trying to demonstrate. Why could it not be the picture on the upper left?
Not enough.
Huh?
Not as many stones.
There's not 12 stones there, is there? So that couldn't be a good example. What about the one in the middle?
Stones aren't big enough, well, they're not big enough to carry on your shoulder.
Well, some of them were so small, I can't see a big old man picking up this little rock and carrying it on his shoulder. I doubt that they're going to be small ones like that. I don't know that for sure, but that doesn't look realistic to me. What about the upper right?
That's very interesting.
That's a possibility. I look at that one on the bottom, and I don't know if that's one too big to pick up, put on your shoulder or not. We don't have a perspective. We don't have anything beside it to see how big that rock really is. But that's a possibility. That gives you a general idea how something might look. What about the lower left?
That looks more like an altar.
It is an altar. Very much. They put the stones around them. They had times that they had built altars as a memorial as well. But there's a lot more than 12 stones there.
Yes.
And you see the sticks where they were going to build the fire. So that's really an altar. It really is. Then the one on the lower right. Huh?
It's not river rock, it's granite.
Oh, that's a good point. How do you know it's not river rock?
She knows they're rocks.
No, they're rocks. Because you know rock. But what about,
Rocks out of every
It's not
state.
smooth.
what's the difference between these rocks and these rocks?
Roundness.
Rounded, smooth. So your point's well taken. Rounded, smooth. Now, none of these are the real ones, but it just kind of give us an idea. That you figure he wants to pick up one, a big one. He wants to be manly and carry a big one. He's not going to carry a little tiny one. But it can't be so big that he can't pick it up. So that's the type of war. Now, how long do you think those stones would sit there and not get, they're not there today. They're not protected.
I've been there.
Somebody's gonna go, huh?
I would have stolen them.
Okay, let's go on now. The priest who carried the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan River until the flood came over and drowned them. And then, why? Is anybody paying attention?
We're listening.
I just want to make sure you're paying attention. They were standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything the Lord had commanded Joshua was done by the people. Once the stones were moved and carried out of there, just as Moses had directed Joshua. He had directed Moses, directed Joshua. The people hurried over, and as soon as all of them had crossed, the ark of the Lord and the priests came to the other side while the people watched. The men of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh crossed over ready for battle in front of the Israelites as Moses had directed them. Moses was on the other side before he died. You remember, these 2.5 tribes said, we want to settle this land on the east side of the Jordan. And Moses consults with God and said, that's fine, you can do that, but you must what?
Fight with the others.
You must cross. You can leave your women and children, your cattle and sheep behind, but you have to cross, and you have to go and help them fight until they've all won the portion of land assigned to them. Then you can go back. So that's what this is in reference to. These that went across are ready for that. About 40,000 armed for battle crossed over before the Lord to the plains of Jericho for war. That's what they were going for war, because they already had their land. That day the Lord exalted Joshua. We talked about that last week. I said there was 2 things that God needed to do. He needed to exalt Joshua. Exalt means to lift up. He needed to lift up Joshua so the people understood they've been following Moses' leadership all this time, and God was with Moses, and he needed to make sure they understood that God is with Joshua just as he was with Moses. And so we used that word last week in chapter 3, talking about God needed to exalt Joshua before the people so they would have confidence to follow him. And he said, that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of Israel. They stood in awe of him all the days of his life, just as they stood in awe of Moses. He accomplished what he wanted to do. But the other thing I said last week, there was 2 things he wanted to do. The other, God also wanted to make sure that it was God that worked the miracles, not Joshua. God worked the miracles. Then the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant law to come up out of the Jordan. So once everybody had crossed and cleared, then they were instructed to come up. So Joshua commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. And the priests came up out of the river carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. No sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place, and it ran at flood stage as before. That was the time of the year of the harvest, is when the water came down and it went over the banks. That's what made the fertile land. That's why they grew so many good crops there. The land of milk and honey. On the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry land.
Well, it's something, that word dry really gets me, you know.
Yeah.
Because the waters had been there.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Yeah.
muddy ground. It
Yeah.
was dry.
It's one thing to move the waters back, but to dry the mud up. Dry land. God works the miracles. Joshua is just his puppet, doing what he tells him to do to lead the people. It says, for the Lord your God dried up the Jordan. There's even more. Dried it up. Before you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, so that you might always fear the Lord your God. Now, 3 weeks ago, Joe Beth taught the lesson in here about Rahab and the spies. And I think about when I read this, because Rahab, now remember, this is before they crossed the Jordan. Rahab said, all of Jericho fears the Israelites, because we have heard about how you have captured and conquered all these nations moving as you get closer. The people of Jericho were in fear because they had heard. But Rahab said that, I know that it's your God that has led you. Not just fear the army. She knew that they had a God that did this. Today, the Bible serves as a great memorial. It's a reminder of all the works and the wonderful and powerful God. But we must read the Bible, we must study the Bible, we must meditate on God's Word, so we will never forget. Forget what?
God's word.
Huh?
God's word.
Forget anything in there that God has done. All the works that He's done, we read about Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. He's done so many of these great works, and we keep coming in here and studying, and we're learning about more of them. And some of them, you say, oh, I'd forgotten about that one. Yeah, I remember now what God did.
You know, Wallace, when I was a little girl and we were studying all this as children, they were interesting stories. But when you mature and you're meditating and thinking about all, it wasn't just for the Israelites, because that's why I had to read it.
Yeah.
It's for us to know the power of God.
It is. We're just fortunate to live in the time in the world that
Yes.
we can have the Bible and read and know all these things. We don't have to depend on some stones stacked over here and ask Mom and Dad, what the heck does that mean? And then them tell you the story of it. We can read it and learn it for ourselves. God had the Israelites build memorials and participate in feasts and festivals so they would not forget some of the wonderful miracles that God worked for the Israelites. But what about today? What about you and I? Do you remember the wonderful works that God performed in your life? Do we tend to forget about some of the good things He does for us, but we remember some of the bad things that happen to us? Okay, I would like, we got just a few minutes left, for someone to share a time in your life when God did something, and you know it was God that did it. Anybody?
I have a long one. I don't know if you got
No, I don't want a long one. You got to make it brief.
Okay.
Willie. Willie.
Yeah,
Oh,
I have tried very hard to become a member of a certain air crew in Shreveport, and I wasn't able to get on that crew. That crew went into a mountain, and everybody on board still.
wow.
I know that God kept me from it.
Okay, that's great. You'll never forget that, will you? Jan, did you have one?
Well, I'll just speak to the miracle of Rex.
Yes.
You know, when Rex was coughing blood, I took him to the hospital, and they tested him, and they said that cancer was in his bronchial tubes and was in his bloodstream. And he had cancer surgery, and the surgeon came out and said it didn't look good. All of the lymph nodes, he took out all 28, they were all cell in those lymph nodes. And he never had to have chemo, and I praise God for that. But this class and hundreds of people across this nation prayed for Rex.
Yeah.
And I believe that's my
You
miracle.
don't have any trouble believing
No,
that
that's
God
that's
did
a
that.
miracle, absolutely.
I lived through that terrible car accident.
Okay?
Yes,
And you did
God
that
was-
because God took care of you, right?
exactly.
See, so many times in our lives, we go to a point, like Willie's talking about, you reach a point and you can't go any further. And you just stop. Say, well, yeah, that's it. I can't do anymore. And then God takes over. I think He lets us go to that dead-end street so that we understand that what's happening next it's God's. I'm going to tell you one real quickly, and I have 7 in my life that I hold on to. One of them is when Glenn and I got married. We were right out of high school, and we moved to Houston and bought an old used house trailer, and we didn't have enough of the down payment. We lived on the back of the lot where they sell trailers until we gave them enough money to move out. Well, after we lived in it 1 year, we said, we're going to sell it, and we're going to move into an apartment and then try to get a little house. So I ran an ad in the newspaper for a week. I wanted $500 for my equity out of the trailer, somebody pick up the payments. We went a week and never got a phone call. Not a one. I really wanted to get into an unfurnished apartment. What am I going to have? When I sell the trailer, I have nothing. We bought the trailer because it comes with furniture. I knew it was an old beat up one. Well, we had reached the dead end street. There were no phone calls, nothing. And then several days later, after that, the phone rings. And the guy says, do you still have your trailer? I said, yeah. He said, well, I'll make you a deal. I'll give you all the furniture in my house instead of the $500. He said, now it's not good furniture. It's old, it's used, but it's lots of it. I said, let me come see it. There was 2 bedrooms of furniture. There was a rollaway bed. There was a dining table. And the kitchen was one of those little, you remember, laminated top things with the chrome around it and all that stuff. And the chairs that matched. And we got the small refrigerator and an old washer, but it worked. And a dining room table and some chairs. Even have a desk. Had all this stuff. Yeah, I couldn't have bought any of that hardly for $500. How much would I be involved? Even though that was the 1960s. So when we reached the dead end, nobody called. You're like this. What do we do next? I don't know. God says, I'll take over. That was a miracle. I had enough furniture to go to an unfurnished apartment then, and it was about a year, and we bought our first little house. They said you paint it for the down payment. So it was one of the HUD homes, I think they're called. We went to, said we'd buy it. The payment, the monthly payment on the house was the same as the monthly payment on my rent for my apartment. We went to paint it, and somebody had already painted it. And then didn't buy the house. So we didn't have to paint it. Now, who gets the credit for all that?
Amen.
Not Glenda and I. God, so when you run into a dead-end street, that's when God says, okay, now that you know for sure you can't do it yourself, I'll do it. And I can give you more, and we're not going to do it because we got about 2 minutes left here. But, oh, that clock's fast. We got 4 minutes, maybe. Hey.
Remember when Marlene's in the hospital, they said, well, if she lives, she'll be a vegetable.
Oh, okay. Is she a vegetable? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Come on. All right, you need to speak up.
But they didn't ever tell me what kind of
I'm a
vegetable.
half vegetable.
You're a little pumpkin.
You know when Ernie speaks, it's going to go. Anybody else go? Pat?
You know what? I think the most special thing in my life is God keeping me because I strayed in my younger years, knowing I was miserable all the time. And I was close to a lot of things that He kept me out of. And I thank Him all the time for keeping me and not turning loose and not taking that spirit from me, knowing that I was not doing right. And that's the most precious thing.
But you recognize
He did
it was
not
God,
give up
didn't
on
he?
me.
Yes.
Someone
Yeah.
was praying with him.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody else? Well, we're going to close here in just a second on this, but I know we've all got them in our lives. A lasting memorial is the cross, isn't it? We'd never forget. May we never forget what Jesus did for us on the cross. And Bill, Linda, and Sherry and David, we're glad y'all came. There's a lot of good life groups and they got some good teachers, but they don't have this kind of people. When I'm on my deathbed, I want this group. Wonderful people in here. We'll have a closing prayer. Y'all may stay seated as you will. Father, we thank you for the